Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com.
Okay, well, the topic for today is Scandalized by Management, a jaded look at adult working life and how to thrive anyway. So, Chris, on this topic of being scandalized or surprised by management and leadership, what's your story?
Yeah, I think I was always surrounded by leadership as a kid. I grew up, everybody in my family was military officers of some sort, and very involved in scouts as a kid and church. And so saw lots of different, people standing in front of people and trying to do something. So, I guess that was my introduction. And, as a kid and then even growing up into college, you kind of think, well, this person's doing a good job because everybody's happy and things are getting accomplished.
Right.
And these people are not doing a job, but there's never any thought. It was like either you had it or you don't. But then as you start to step into junior leadership roles as you get out of college and different stuff, in my time joining the military, then you start to learn some stuff and you actually start to get in the lab of life and leadership. And it's where you start to realize that there's some stuff behind it. So, but then you actually expect that the people that helm organizations or groups that aren't just kind of like your local community choir, which lots of community choirs have great leadership, but, say the head of a Fortune 500 company or a larger organization, that, hey, the people, the higher up the totem pole you're going to get, the actual better management.
So that's what you expected, Chris. You expected to see better management at the higher echelons of organizations. And how did that match with your reality?
Well, I mean, that was the kind of fantasy was like, hey, I'm not getting the stuff I need. Oh, well, that's because I'm down in the trenches, right? So if I get up there, it'll finally, and at each step along the way, I was both alternately scandalized or thrilled, because you would find surprising leadership at like line level type stuff, and then you'd find really actual poor leadership at the higher levels. So I would say I don't want to dime anybody out, but I have been in some specific places. I can dime a little bit. I've had some really poor leadership in the military before. But what about you, Ben?
Yeah, so my experience, I definitely can empathize with what you were saying in terms of, seeing people early on in life at standing in front of groups and talking and that we thought that was leadership and so forth. And then as I was going through college, I was on a Navy ROTC scholarship, so I was getting ready to go on active duty in the U.S. Navy, and I had this impression as a naive 21-year-old that this was the greatest Navy that had ever sailed on planet Earth, and that it was going to run like a well-oiled machine. And I was somewhat surprised, not by the fact that the U.S. Navy wasn't competent, because it certainly was. It is the best Navy on the planet that has ever existed. However, things don't run as smoothly as you may think they do. There's a lot of individual variation in terms of how effective people are in leading each other. Sometimes people have alternative motives that you don't really see, or ulterior motives that are hidden that make the organization not work as well as you think it would. So you get a little bit, I was a little bit surprised and perhaps scandalized by seeing some of that. But then I actually saw even more of it when I made the transition off of active duty into the civilian world, in which these kind of norms about, taking responsibility for stuff, holding each other and yourself accountable for stuff, that these were not very widespread, at least in my experiences in the civilian sector, because there at least wasn't a core set of expectations, because, we can certainly find good and bad examples of leadership all throughout the military, and you and I can talk for hours probably about that. But at the same time, at least there's some common expectations, some common training that's given early on and is at least kind of held as a standard of some sort. So that was kind of my experiences early on. And, I just saw it certainly later on doing a lot of consulting work and being around senior level people, seeing a lot of pettiness. There's I think there's a book out there, something about like all life is like high school or something. And I mean, you see that, right? You see people who are backstabbing each other. You see people who are just moody and recalcitrant executives who I'm like, you should be doing what's best for the organization. And here you are, doing things that are totally in your self-interest or just counterproductive altogether. And it violated my sense of integrity, right? You're there to serve, the organization and to help it to succeed and to help everyone there thrive and flourish. And it just wasn't happening. So I was definitely surprised by that. And I continue to see that. I think it's a fairly common feature of adult working life.
It's everywhere. So, I guess those frustrations were what drove a kind of odd curiosity about this stuff, about, what can be known about management and, these terms kind of get mixed up, like leadership. We need some executive leadership or we need more management. So Ben, if you had to distill the difference between management and leadership, what would they be?
Sure. So first of all, I think that there are differences between management and leadership at a theoretical level, at a practical level. I think that any organization needs good doses of both of them, right? So sometimes leadership gets held up as, stop managing, start leading. Well, no, you got to have both. Otherwise, your organization isn't going to work well. So to define these, one thing that I come back to, this was something that the now retired Harvard professor John Kotter, who's written a lot on change, and I have major issues with some of what he does on organizational change, but he does have a good article where he talks a little bit about leadership and how it's different from management. And he says that management is about dealing with helping people and organizations to deal with complexity. And leadership is about helping an organization cope with change. And I think there's a good amount of truth there. Leadership is oftentimes the aspect of organizational life that is more concerned with how to influence and inspire and set strategy and how to ensure that the organization and its members are doing the right thing. Versus just doing things right. So sometimes management is a little bit more about efficiency, getting things done, with as few resources as possible or in an efficient manner, and is a little bit more tactical, whereas leadership is much more big picture, vision type stuff. And of course, any organization needs a lot of both to work well. So I'm an advocate for both, strong management and leadership skills throughout organizations, because you can't just have a whole bunch of people who are only doing the leadership aspect of things and ignoring actually getting stuff done, which is kind of the nature of management.
Yeah. The thing that's surprising to me is, when you work someplace, everybody expects you to know your job, right? So, can you write these lines of code? Can you develop a go-to-market strategy? Or these aspects. I mean, there's like hard skills, and you'll see them in these job descriptions that people post, right, on LinkedIn or whatever. But the body of knowledge around management and leadership is actually, I don't know, it's not a recent, study. So it's just curious to me how companies don't have this as a requisite skill, or if this is not like requisite training that just kind of goes on. Like everybody knows how to tie their shoes. Everybody should probably at some level be familiar with some of the leadership models, like situational leadership or, some of those items. And they're just not.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, I think some of the best organizations out there do some of this in terms of their talent management and leadership development types of initiatives where they really actively try to assess and identify who their high potential leaders are, and then putting them through experiences and training that helps to develop them. So there is some of that does happen. But you're right that we've known a lot about leadership for quite a long time. I mean, we have about a century worth of research from organizational psychology, which helps us, and certainly there's no lack of pop psychology books out there on the topic. You can find
mostly bad books, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, usually they're full of a bunch of irrefutable laws and unfalsifiable theses about what leaders do and so forth.
It's like cure your management woes with Windex and this one easy trick.
That's right. And so some of them are kind of like you remember the 8-minute abs. It's like somebody comes out with 7-minute abs. Remember that was the big joke in that in that movie. There's something about Mary, right? That was a big joke.
Yeah. Like spray paint them on, have them now.
Yes. Maybe we could come up with a book that's just the one irrefutable law of leadership. Might be better and even easier than whatever the other ones are. But I mean, I think any of these models and books that are out there, just while we're on the topic, I think there's usually some truth in them. And the problem that I have with some of it is it's anecdotal, and oftentimes derived just from one person's experience, versus some of the fundamentals that we do know from more rigorous social science research on the topic. And so, yeah, I mean, I think going back to your point about why don't organizations have all of this be stuff that people go through, in terms of necessary requisite skills for certain levels? Well, I think that some organizations do it, a lot of them don't, and some of them that do, even just talking to, I know a lot of people who do talent management, who do leadership development in big organizations, and even they are somewhat scandalized by their own organization's efforts in these areas because they're like, they're just saying, hey, we're just doing lip service to this, we're not and they're struggling with the internal organizational constraints because no managers want to give up their people for a long period of time to go do some sort of leadership development or something, So I was actually talking with a person who runs this type of stuff at a very large, well-known hospital organization. And, he said, think about from the organization's perspective, if you've got a cardiothoracic surgeon who is in a leadership development program for a while, that's a rather expensive proposition, right? Because they're not out there doing stuff that's making the organization money. So, I think
I think those things are, that's where this stuff needs to be part of the lexicon of how we raise people, period, globally. Like if you're learning this through, K through 12, college, grad school, if that's part of your medical education. Well, I mean, there's several facets of that piece. So like if that's just part of the practical humanities that people can grow up and live in, that's going to make the world better for everybody. And then, a comment I'd like to make is like a lot of the organizations that we're in and that I've seen, it's okay, we're going to do this leadership training and it's a death by PowerPoint, or, we always say it's like, okay, here's a book on boxing. Now go get in the ring and be able to execute. And that's just not how people learn, right? And then the other common one I see is you'll have, whatever level that, like for our consulting stuff, when we come into an organization, somebody says, come do all this wonderful people development within my organization, but don't ask me to actually change anything. Well, hey, I'm the CEO. Yeah, do whatever you want as long as I get to be me, type. That's right. Let the CEO be the CEO. And then it creates this like kind of organizational cognitive dissonance because, if you do actually run a robust training, coaching, mentoring, your organization becomes healthy. And then maybe that leadership person actually isn't and is still, playing with this kind of tried and true bag of tricks. But so let's maybe shift a little bit here. So let's talk about, say, incompetent management and leadership. So Ben, why does it persist? I mean, we see it, we experience it, it drives us nuts. Why isn't it getting fixed?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons why incompetent management and leadership persists in organizations. It is a rather vexing problem, though. It's kind of like families. You would expect that every family, if they learn and don't repeat the mistakes of how they grew up, that families would just increasingly get better and they'd move all the error out of how they parent and things would be perfect. And that you'd think that the same thing would happen with management and leadership, right? That people have managers and leaders who maybe did some things that didn't work so well, and they would try to not repeat those mistakes. They would learn from the good and the bad, and that over time, organizations would just get better at this, and people would just get better at this. But that's just not the case because we're human. We're full of, our minds are incredibly complex. Our motivations are incredibly complex. And just at a practical level, a lot of times in organizations, promotion into a position in which you are leading others is not based upon your leadership skills. This is the classic case of the amazing salesperson who, gets promoted into being the sales manager. And the problem with that is that what got you to a level of success in that current role isn't what's necessarily what's going to make you successful in your next role. There's a big shift that needs to happen. And so when you have promotion based upon individual contributor success, that's not necessarily going to translate into leadership or management success.
Right. And I also think a lot of how people come to their style or person, and there's research into stuff like authentic leadership and all these different types of leadership. But, most people that I run into, it's, well, I had these mentors or examples in my life and, kind of a monkey see, monkey do approach. Or, you'll read books about, okay, the Steve Jobs way, the Warren Buffett way, all of these ideas, which the challenging part is, first of all, you're not Jobs or Buffett, right? If my
Don't fool yourself.
Yeah. If my success in life was dependent on me being like one of those people,
right.
Ouch. There's not a whole bunch of hope for me in that place.
Well, and like Steve Jobs, a lot of people, and you hear the accounts of how he actually led. He was kind of a jerk.
Right. Which, like, hey, there's literature around like, hey, you can be a total jerk and get stuff done, but
yeah,
what do you want to do with that as far as like people in life?
Yeah. Well, and some of this, comes back to like how you want to be remembered and how you want to live your life and how you want to treat other people. I think it's, some of these really big questions of integrity that come into developing your own leadership style.
Right. So when we look at all these incompetent leaders, from the top to the bottom, they've got no role model. They don't have like any kind of pedagogical or teaching methodology to, I know that stuff that I asked when I was younger in my career in the military. I'd asked my lieutenants, like, how are you going to develop your subordinate leaders? And they just had no clue because they weren't familiar with the leadership materials or any of that kind of knowledge base and all that stuff. It can get kind of depressing, right?
It can.
But, one of the things that I always take from design thinking is like, hey, let's take that depressing item or thing and just look it straight in the eye and see the world for how it is, not how we would hope it would be. So you actually plan a way forward that rather than just make it through to the end of life and die, that we can actually thrive and live a good life now.
Right. Yeah. So it's we can try to change the world, or in terms of the fundamental ways in which people behave, or we can actually accept the way that reality exists and deal with that. So if people don't have good role models, they're not necessarily going to read the stuff you tell them to, or maybe there's not good stuff available. So then the question becomes, how do we engage in a more human-centered approach to help people get better at these types of things, right?
Right. So now let's maybe shift from the, oh, what a bleak picture here, and let's talk about what can people and organizations do to begin to thrive. So, like maybe, I mean, Ben, you teach, you're a professor, you've got lots of students that are coming through, grad students that are kind of mid-career as well.
Yeah.
What would some of the things that you tend to tell them?
Yeah, so there are a handful of things that we talk about, and so I teach in our MBA program. We also have a master's program in HR that I teach in, and these are folks who are kind of in that nexus of moving into leadership roles or trying to figure out their careers and so forth. And I think one of them is just coming to a realization that there are things that you can control and there are things that you can't control. So recognizing what your scope of influence is in your current level, in your current career path or trajectory, knowing what you can and you cannot change, that can be really helpful. Because if it's something that's outside of your control, then you need to figure out a way to deal with it that uses things that you can control. So if you have a terrible boss who's just mistreating you in all these different ways, well, you're probably not going to necessarily change the way your boss is behaving, but you can change your reactions to your boss. You can look at different options within your organization to remedy that situation or maybe move somewhere else and so forth. But you have to recognize what you can and cannot change. I think that's one of the first things that's really important, in terms of personal thriving and survival in your career, is understanding that basic fact.
Yeah, I think of like some of the stuff around differentiation and not being emotionally infected by the scandal that you kind of see around you. I mean, you're going to live a pretty tired life if you're like, but Ben, there's somebody messed up in accounting. Well, you don't work in accounting. I know, but right? You can't just be subjected to the emotional whims of the stuff around you, and realizing that, hey, we live in a primordial ooze of all kinds of shenanigans, and and you just have to get kind of narrow in your scope. Like if your job, you're just starting out and your job's to make the coffee, well, gosh darn it, let's make really good coffee every day, and plan your way forward. Another thing that I'm big on is this idea of collaborative alliances, with your peers and with anybody that will offer you one.
What do you mean? So Chris, what do you mean? First of all, going back, you use a great term, differentiation. I love unpack that a little bit. And then if you could just unpack the collaborative alliance thing. So differentiation followed by collaborative alliances, because I think those are really great ways to think about how you position yourself within a team, within a group, and certainly as you navigate your career.
Well, I would encourage anybody to go read all of it. It's Bowen, Bowen, his research. We'll pop a show note with some links to who that person is. But just talks about it's really becoming your own person, which means you know who you are, you know what your values are, and how you want to navigate this world, which will grow iteratively. But you make your changes to yourself based on who you are and your values, rather than external pressures and those kinds of items. So it's really, I mean, to summarize, it's standing on your own 2 feet. And that's something that you're going to need as you go through life. And how do you even evaluate what type of organization you want to work with or for?
And so part of it, for what I'm just kind of trying to paraphrase what you're saying there. So part of being differentiated is having less of an emotional dependence upon how other people see me. Is that part of it?
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's a whole host of things. So, hard to just completely summarize it, but you're just your own person, right?
Yeah. And what's funny too is now in an age in which most people are immersed quite frequently in social media, is that I think there's a tendency, if you're not careful, to base a lot of kind of how you feel throughout the day on external validation. How many people are liking your little picture or whatever that you posted and stuff like that, right? Where we're doing a lot of social comparison and not being maybe as differentiated as we should be. And not to say that there's some sort of, big cognitive shift that's happened here. I don't really know. That's a kind of an empirical question, but I think the question does remain, how do you develop yourself so that you can stand on your own 2 feet effectively in life and in an organization?
Right. So just to pulled up here real quick, the official definition of differentiation of self from Bowen, the ability to be in emotional contact with others, yet still autonomous in one's own emotional functioning is the essence of the concept of differentiation. So It's just not being infected. And then, the thing that, I run into a lot is people come to work and they're looking for a social support group, which is, completely rational because you spend so much time at work, and they're looking to develop friendships. But I would posit that your work relationships are different than your friendships. And that's where the idea of a collaborative alliance, I think, is important, because you're actually there to achieve something, to do something together, and viewing it as an alliance, a collaborative alliance, right, is, I think, the better kind of scope or idea.
Yeah. And I don't take it to mean that, or that I don't think you mean that you can't be friends with people at work, right? So we work together, and I think we're pretty good friends. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But
no, that would be accurate.
Okay, good. But I think the point of the collaborative alliance is that if I'm at work and, I just, for whatever reason, I can't be friends with these people, or I don't really see the need to, we have no interests in common, et cetera, that, hey, I'm here to help achieve some sort of bigger objective. And so my best bet, or a good approach, is towards this idea of building a collaborative alliance with that person in order to achieve some sort of outcome. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not, a lot of people look for some kind of emotional connection or feedback. That probably is not going to be forthcoming in the first little bit. And especially as you head into the more executive levels of your career, you're going to have to dictate and set strategy based on, some kind of moral compass, or this thing that's in your heart, or, there becomes kind of an art, and you're actually stepping out ahead of the crowd rather than looking to your left and right for the emotional feedback that, yes, this is good.
Yeah. Awesome. So you differentiate, you build these collaborative alliances. I think another thing that I would certainly emphasize to anyone, regardless of where they are in their career, and you've kind of already touched on this yourself a little bit, is knowing your values. Because if you don't know what you stand for, what are those things that you will and will not tolerate, personally and professionally? If you know those things, then those can be a North Star in and of themselves for you professionally and personally, as you navigate this crazy world, right? So, it's about, having some sort of moral compass. What are those things that you're going to try to do to make the organization you're in a better place? Try to, again, knowing your scope of influence, being that change that you want to see around you.
Right. And then, some of that stuff, if you are going to stand on your own 2 feet, develop meaningful collaborative alliances, and, have your values, your moral compass, that's going to drive you to have to leave organizations at time. That's not going to be a good fit. Some of these, I don't know, the first idea that comes to mind is entrepreneur founder who loves its company, and really he hires people, or she hires people, to just make them feel good about themselves, and maybe rewards aren't based on merit, or a whole host of other sometimes there's just, or illegality, somebody's doing something illegal, like whistleblower type issues. Sometimes it's just time to leave.
Sure. Yeah. Or if you find that you have your skills and abilities, or your skills and your knowledge have outpaced kind of your current role, and there are opportunities elsewhere, that may be a signal that it's time to go too. Something I always say to my students is that, hey, if you find that you are more frequently than not the smartest person in the room, then, it might be a good idea to try to find another room.
Yeah, except for you, Ben. You're all alone because you're such an intellectual giant.
Yeah, right. Not a chance.
One thing that you mention often is the Tarzan approach, which I think is super easy to remember that name. What is the Tarzan approach, Ben?
So this is what I talk about with my students, and I didn't come up with this. I can't remember where I heard it. I just don't want to claim that I'm the originator of the term, but a lot of times students will come to me, graduate students, they're getting their MBA, maybe they're getting close to graduating, they're saying, hey, I'm going to become a little bit more marketable, trying to think about a career shift or something. And what I always try to emphasize to them is, hey, don't, just quit. Sometimes they're like, I want to start my own business. It's like, well, hold on a second. You need to think about your own life situation and your income stream and all that kind of stuff. And the Tarzan approach is to make sure that you have a reasonably firm grasp on a new opportunity before you let go of the current one. So this is Tarzan swinging through the jungle, right? So this is, get that vine and hang on. Make sure you have it firmly before you let go of the previous one. And ideally, you're doing that without burning bridges behind you, because you never know, who you're going to come across professionally and so forth. So I think that's one way to think about your career. Now, are there instances in which you can just make or should just make a dramatic change in your career? Yeah, probably. We could probably come up with some good examples of that. But I think in general, the Tarzan approach is one that can be helpful for a lot of folks.
Right. I know that even when you're in a bad situation, I've been under some bad leadership in the military and in the civilian sector, and everybody kind of knows it's bad. And so if you do good work and the people around you know you as somebody that has integrity, who does good work, that supports other people, those people are going to help you further down in your career as part of your network, which networking can have kind of like a kind of campy, hey, what have you done for me lately vibe. But, we've been in situations where somebody needs a clutch HR person right away. And and if they need somebody, they can't wait. Well, they're going to tap their network first and be like, hey, Fred's a good guy, or Jane's a good, person we could get in there, that kind of thing. And they'll know that because they've worked with you in the trenches and seen how you thrive even in adversity, right?
Yeah. And that's actually reminds me of something I was going to say earlier that, and I think is when you were talking about, hey, if your job is to make the coffee, make the best darn coffee that you can, right?
Right.
You never know who's watching. Sometimes it may feel like you're just a cog in a machine and no one cares about the hard work you're doing. That is not an excuse to not do good work. Always do your best work, both from a personal, sign of integrity and trying to just do the best you can, but also just from the standpoint that someone somewhere probably is noticing. And as you mentioned, people do like to help each other out. I have a lot of opportunities, working with graduate students that, where they have career questions or things, and I love being able to put them in touch with somebody who can help them out. I always say at the end of the semester, I say, keep in touch. If you don't keep in touch, it's your fault, not mine. And then I have this slide where I show like all the places where I am on social media and how easy it is to find me. Right. So, and I'm like, it really is your fault if you can't find me. But I kind of joke about it, but I really do enjoy helping people when I can. It's fun. It's, people help me out along the way as I went through my career, and it's good to be able to do that for other people. In fact, someone emailed me yesterday, a former student said, hey, would you be able to look at my resume and tell me if, how it looks and so forth? And I said, yeah, I'll do that. But first, tell me what you're looking for and so forth. And then I was like, great. Let's have a call. So I'm going to talk to her a little bit later today. And, I think that's something that people like to do, and, never hesitate to ask, especially, because a lot of these things that we've been talking about here, I think are really important for, how to thrive, despite the scandalous management and so forth, at really those early career type positions. So people do like to help.
Yeah, two things I'd also like to add. Like for me personally, one of the things of my differentiation journey, if you could say that, is that I'm going to make the best darn coffee, not because my manager or my peers made me feel good about making good coffee, but I'm going to do it because that's the substance of who I am. And that person, to hit the Gandhi quote, be the change you want to see in the world. Well, like I want to be the person I want to be in the world, regardless of whatever. Now, if I'm only that person when it's easy and I'm getting accolades, that really doesn't say much about my character, right?
Right.
So like for me, that's been a big thing. My form of differentiation is being that person. And then I think something else that I would tell a young person coming up is, hey, get involved in some kind of leadership position. If that's, heading up a community choir, a lot of this stuff has to be learned in the lab of life. But when you go to hit that lab of life, don't just do it blindly. There's no need for you to try to come up with all these management theories on your own, right? So if you can go learn some of the basics of organizational behavior, leadership, management, HR stuff, all that kind of stuff, you'll actually be able to recognize which leaders are kind of doing it well or not just making people feel good, because sometimes leaders get accomplished what needs to be accomplished and it really hacks a bunch of people off, but it's really the best thing in the end. And, culture and their ethics judge them after the fact, long after all their followers have dispersed and are in another organization. But if you understand those basics of organizational behavior, leadership, and those kinds of things, you can seek out those good leaders. Also, you can use it as a way to detect which culture exists at the organizations you might want to be in, so you can guide your career path. But all of that stuff has to be practiced in a lab. Like you can watch and get good coaching on boxing, but if you never step into the ring, so I'd encourage people, there's so many nonprofits, so many things, especially, if you're just kind of setting out on this journey, get some experience, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, those kinds of items, you got to get out there, but don't go blind. Don't crash through that wall on your own. Do it with the knowledge of all this organizational psychology and stuff, the best practice behind you.
Yeah, that's great. And, I oftentimes tell people, like, when we talk about networking, networking to some people is going into a crowded room where they don't know anybody and seeing who they can hand their business card to. It's ridiculous, right?
What does that even do other than waste paper, right?
Nothing. I actually was at a professional conference once where this poor young soul, there was a group of us on the elevator, and we were going, just imagine, from the first floor to the 10th floor. So we were all on the elevator together, and then the elevator stops at the second floor, and this youngish person got on, and the door closes, and we go up maybe one floor. So it's a very short period of time, and just without saying anything or just barely saying anything, this young guy just handed us all his business cards and then ran out the door. And then the doors closed again, and we all just kind of look at each other. And we're like, well, that's one way to do it, I guess. But you're right, it's so meaningless. So going back to your point about nonprofits and getting involved in stuff, if you are, I think professional organizations too. So let's say you're in HR and you join your local, Society for Human Resource Management chapter. The best way to start showing people that you're competent and to really start to get to know people and actually network, I think, is volunteer to be on a committee. I mean, they are always looking for people to volunteer on stuff and get in, and you can very quickly, oftentimes, be able to make an impact, and it can be really great. So I would second what you said there, absolutely.
Okay, so most of what we just talked about, I mean, it's good for everybody, but kind of has a focus on early mid-career people just getting out of college, grad school, those kinds of items. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about for that mid-level person, and that sounds so judgmental. Are you a mid-level person? But well, let's say for people with management responsibilities, how can they thrive in this kind of environment that we just listed?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, and this is coming from a hopelessly biased perspective of me being a professor as well as a consultant, is that training can help. It's great to be able to know what right looks like, and to learn from the research on all of this stuff. related to organizational psychology, related to organizational behavior, how people behave in organizations, what leadership looks like, what it doesn't look like. And it's very helpful to understand all of those different facets and put them into practice in your organization. So I think some training can help at first.
Let me ask a question on that. Just interrupt you here for a minute. So training. So you're interested. You've been in a management role. You're super excited about being better because you look at the people that report to you or in your peers, and you just feel a strong need to be your best for them. There's so much garbage out there.
There is.
Where do you go to find data-driven, research-validated information that is, not so dense that you need a PhD to sort it?
Well, I think the first place, obviously, is www.indigopodcast.com. Listen
nice.
to. Well, and I'm half joking because I think we are really trying to reach people in a way that is grounded in the science and yet isn't, spoken about or written about in an esoteric way that is that is not understandable to folks. We want to make these types of concepts accessible to everyone. So, I think there are a number of good books out there, and I think we'll put some links perhaps in the show notes for this episode, some places to get started. I would look, I would go away probably from some of the kind of really popular types of books that are more anecdotal in nature, that you may find, in your local bookstore or in the airport. I would probably not start with those.
Look at the authors.
Are these people who have some sort of research base? Are they at least drawing upon the research? Are they citing the research? Because there are some people, you don't have to be a PhD to write an awesome leadership book by any stretch. But are they drawing upon some of those types of streams of research? Are they perhaps, building upon our knowledge instead of just telling a bunch of stories? Because the problem is with some of these stories is that they can be highly convincing. They can be we're drawn to narratives. You and I have talked about that before, and that's kind of how humans remember things really well. We like stories. And yet the problem is that if we get too enraptured by stories about what leadership looks like, for example, or what works in a certain organization, is that we're going to just think that every organization is exactly like that. And that can be problematic.
Oh, and the feel good, like these books, like, oh, that was like, there's like chicken soup for the managerial soul or something.
Awful.
And
no, I don't know.
Yeah, it does. But it's that idea of like, oh, you felt so much catharsis from reading this story, right? That when you, well, what are you going to do with it? I've asked executives like, hey, tell me about this book on your bookshelf. What were 2 things you took from that impact how you operate today? And I'll get blank stares.
Yeah.
And but kudos to them for reading because, I find that a lot of execs just buy the book to have on their shelf. They don't actually read. Let's talk a little bit about what we call LMX. Ben, what's LMX stand for?
LMX is it's kind of a whole stream of research in the leadership literature, and it stands for leader-member exchange. And it has to do with this phenomenon in most leadership situations in which leaders develop different relationships with all their subordinates, and those relationships vary in terms of the quality of those relationships. So if you have a high leader-member exchange, that means it's a high-quality relationship with your boss. And very naturally, what this can do in a team, if the leader isn't careful, is that they can start to develop kind of in-groups and out-groups within the team. There are those people that who get along really well with the boss, and people who don't get along really well with the boss. And the people who get along with the boss, there are many advantages to that in terms of...
Right. Anybody that's been in a leadership role has been like, hey, I really like this person. Right. And you just naturally, you have that affinity. And I mean, kind of our focus right now is like, hey, well, if you have a management responsibility, what do you need to be aware of? Right. And you've got to be aware of this in-group, out-group. We'll put some data in the show notes around leader-member exchange. And it's that whole idea of like, fighting implicit bias doesn't have to necessarily deal with minority groups or something. Yet we have implicit bias just on this person makes me feel good. This person doesn't make me feel as good. And those in-group, out-group things. But if you actually want to drive results as a manager or as a leader within your organization, you need to, if you're given a team of 10, you need to fire on all 10 cylinders, which means making sure that you're not excluding people and that you're getting the best performance that you can get out of your team.
Yeah, that's very well put. I think the key here too is that your creation of in-groups and out-groups within a team as a leader can be completely unintentional, right? It's not that you're a nasty person who's going to, with some malicious intent, try to exclude people. Some of it just has to do with our natural bias towards liking people who are like us, right? So in sociology, we call that homophily. So homophily is this phenomenon in which we just tend to like people who are similar to us. It's not necessarily your fault, but you need to be aware of that. It's like, hey, if I had a team and maybe some people had on that team had very similar backgrounds to me, we'd probably be interested in the same stuff. We'd have more to talk about. If I'm not careful, I'm going to be, focusing so much on those folks that I'm going to be excluding the rest of the team. So absolutely something to keep in mind. Developing those high-quality relationships with all of your subordinates can be a way to thrive as a leader if you have those people management responsibilities.
Sure. Another model that I think about that you need to be familiar if you're in management and don't want to be contributing to the scandalization of people is the situational leadership information by, what is it, Hersey and Blanchard? Is it? Yeah. So we'll put that in the show notes. Collaborative alliance. Talk to your subordinates and peers about what a collaborative alliance is and how it's important. Moral compass, that's important throughout the organization. But one of those things that the literature really speaks to is about organizational support. So you need to be a supportive supervisor, but I don't know, Ben, you should be familiar with this literature. Why would you be familiar with this literature, Ben?
So glad you asked. So the whole stream of research on organizational support and its central construct, which is perceived organizational support, is a big area in organizational psychology, and it first started with my academic grandfather. Now, some of you who are not nerdy academics may wonder, well, what is an academic grandfather? Well, it works like this. So my advisor for my dissertation was a professor named Linda Rhodes Shannock. Well, Linda's advisor was Robert Eisenberger. And Robert Eisenberger, so he was my advisor's advisor, which means that he is my academic grandfather. So in 1986, my academic grandfather, Bob, and a handful of co-authors published a paper in the Journal of Applied Psychology. This was back in 1986, called Perceived Organizational Support. And they were talking about this idea that in any organization, employees, to some degree, develop kind of global perceptions about the degree to which that organization values their contributions and cares about their well-being. Those are the two big pieces, that the organization values my contributions and cares about my well-being. And based upon this perception of organizational support, it's a completely perceptual type of idea, this construct. I think the organization really cares about me as a person and values what I do for the organization. I'm going to have I'm going to feel an obligation to reciprocate back to the organization. I'm going to do that through I'm going to work harder. I'm going to be more committed to the organization. And it also has some benefits for me. There's kind of these socio-emotional benefits. I'm going to be happier on the job. I'm going to have lower stress and so forth. And so this is kind of this whole area of research that started back in the mid-'80s and has really blossomed over the past number of decades. And so I've done some work in this area, and combining all of that research on this idea of perceived organizational support with my practical experience, what I've seen in organizations has really made me come to believe that this is a central construct, a central idea for explaining and helping to improve a lot of how organizational behavior happens. I like to kind of think of it as this is kind of the organizational engine that helps an organization work well on a behavioral level. When people feel like their organization values their contributions and cares about their well-being, they are going to be more likely to reciprocate both to the supervisor in terms of more effort, also be more committed to the organization, as well as some of those benefits for the person individually. So does that answer your first question there, Chris?
Yeah, and I think that's like, if somebody hears this for the first time, they're kind of like, oh my gosh, how do you even have to say that?
Yeah.
Like, of course, I'd love to work for an organization like that. And then the second piece is, and I don't know if it just points to like kind of hubris or like moral failing on the part of a lot of leadership, is you can't fake this. Like, people in an organization knows when the organization really gives a rip about them or not, It's like, well, what if I got them Starbucks gift cards? And I'm like, no, that's not going to erase like a decade plus of bad cultural shenanigans that you have, or the fact that, we're in all types of relationships, but we know when somebody really values us from all the nonverbal communication and norms within that place. So, yeah, if you're a manager, you need to be familiar with the idea of being a supportive supervisor and what organizational support looks like.
Right. Yeah, and I think just to highlight, some of the things that predict perceived organizational support. So I talked about some of those outcomes, right? So we agree that it's a good thing. People are going to reciprocate, right? This is based on that norm of reciprocity, which has been found all over the world, every different culture. We all have this fundamental norm that if someone does something nice for us, we, to some degree, feel obligated to reciprocate. So there's all those good outcomes that we talked about. But we also have, it's important to also think about what kinds of things will engender these feelings of support from the organization. And there are really kind of three big buckets of them. The first is supervisor support. So if my supervisor values my contributions and cares about my well-being, then I'm going to think the organization does, because that supervisor is my window through which I view the organization to some degree, depending on whether or not they kind of have credibility, right? Depending on whether or not I perceive that person as being an agent of the organization. I was thinking back to, some of my early experiences on active duty in the Navy, and I had, a supervisor of sorts who was not particularly great. And, to me, at that moment, it was like, it wasn't just that I didn't like that supervisor, it was that I hated the entire United States Navy, right? It was just ridiculous because of course I don't hate the Navy. It's a gigantic organization.
Well, we personify. Yeah. I mean, we personify everything, right? That's just a feature of humanity. So, it doesn't become, this complex organization with multivariate people acting independently. It becomes that company. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So be a supportive supervisor. That's number one. Number two has to do with fairness. So people's perceptions of fairness are very, very powerful, at least for most of us. Most of us are somewhat sensitive to matters of equity and fairness in organizations. And there are kind of two big types of fairness that I think are important to distinguish between. And the first one is what we call procedural, or actually I'll talk about distributive justice, distributive fairness first. And this is the fairness that has to do with outcomes. So did I get what I deserved, in terms of resources, budgets, and so forth, raises, that kind of stuff. That's distributive justice. And we do care a lot about that. And it has big implications for our satisfaction and our performance and so forth, our commitment. But the other type of justice or fairness is called procedural justice or fairness. And this is not about whether or not I got what I thought I deserved, but it's more about do I perceive the process that was used to make those decisions as being fair? And what's interesting is when they compare the outcomes, they both matter, right? We care about the distribution of an allocation of resources, but we actually care a little bit more about the process that was used to make those decisions. And you can think of those times in which maybe you didn't get the raise you deserved, or the budget for your team that you thought you deserved, or so forth. But if you understood why, then you're more likely to accept it. You're going to say, okay, well, I don't really like the outcome, but you know what? That was a pretty doggone fair process, and I'll accept it, right? So I think, and so that's why I oftentimes will coach executives to really be intentional about, whenever they can, it's not always possible, but whenever they can, try to explain the process that was used to make any kind of decision. Now, of course, if the building's on fire, we're not going to explain the process for, how I decided that we're going to leave the building. Sometimes you just have to do stuff, right? But there are oftentimes, I'd say more often than not, we do have the opportunity to explain the process. And of course, that means you have to have a good process to begin with. It's not just, well, we just kind of, threw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall and, try to see what sticks. It has to be better than that. So that's number two. That's fairness. And then the third and final category of things that help us help employees to perceive more organizational support has to do with kind of this large bucket of things that we just kind of call organizational rewards and job conditions. So this is making sure people have the support they need in terms of the tools to do their job. That it's not an environment that is super noisy and dirty and unsafe. They have a desk and a phone if they need it, all that kind of stuff, as well as being fairly compensated in those types of aspects.
Yeah, so if you're at a place, if you're at the C-suite, right, or you have some kind of organizational-wide authority, so you could be like the head of HR, you can definitely dip down into these like management tricks that we're talking about. What are some other things you can do to foster that kind of supportive organization cross-functionally? I mean, we have the what. Let's talk a little bit about the how.
So I think there are a couple of things. One being that you need to be supportive yourself as a supervisor. So, if you're at the top of the organization and you have a team of executives who report to you, the research actually shows statistically that if I am supportive to those people, they're going to be more likely to be supportive to their subordinates. Now, it's not always going to happen, but there is a trickle-down effect that happens. So be a supportive supervisor yourself as a senior executive. But then a lot of this kind of, I think, ties into the whole cultural aspect of things, the culture and climate that you're trying to create in your organization around, making sure that you are expecting and supporting and rewarding those behaviors that make people feel like their contributions are valued and that they're cared about. If you, for example, say all day that you really care about, the flourishing of working mothers in your organization, and yet you don't have any kind of provision for time off when they have a baby and afterwards and that kind of stuff, well, that's not really going to signal that you have any real caring for that segment of your population in your organization, right?
Right.
So I think those are some of the big things. I think rewards and recognition do come into play. But this also ties back to some of the things we already talked about with having those high quality relationships with the people who work with you. And I loved how you said you just can't fake this stuff. You might be able to fake it for like a little while, but people will see through it. You have to, it has to be kind of true to who you are, and you have to actually care about people in order to make them feel like they actually are cared about.
All right, Ben. So let's wrap up. So today's topic was Scandalized by Management, a jaded look at adult working life and how to thrive anyway. I think it's important to summarize like the idea of if you're new in an organization, or even if you've been there for a while, maybe you're a subject matter expert and don't have any authority within the organization, that context is everything. So things you might want to look at are stuff like, hey, what is your industry like? If you're in the television film industry in LA, it's going to be a grind if you're a visual effects artist or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. So, or if you're in the music industry or something like that, there's a lot of people in that place, and it might not just be the most hospitable culture based on structural issues within the industry.
Right.
If you're a buggy whip manufacturer, it's challenging, right? I guess you're like trying to make corporal punishment great again or something, to expand your market.
Yeah, good luck with that.
Right. So, but things you can do at that entry level or subject matter expert level, someplace where you don't, the key point here is like not having a lot of authority within the organization is, hey, build your expertise. If you become known for being really good at something, people will recognize that, and that will help you.
Mm-hmm.
Your personal network. The biggest way to build this, in my view, is just how you conduct yourself around others. And we're not talking necessarily friendship, but we're talking about awesome collaborative alliances, being known as a person of integrity, keeping what you're, doing what you say you'll do, and just being a good, honest person. You get known for that, and that becomes your brand. Now, since we have all these online social media tools and all that kind of stuff, people think about branding is, am I curating my Instagram or how I present myself on Facebook? But I think all of us know that can be heavily curated. The best thing you can do for yourself is building your brand through authenticity, being who you say you are, and actually working on those elements that aren't quite where you want them to be in your personal life.
Right.
I think it's important also to realize that work isn't everything. There are so many ways to thrive in life, and if your job's not doing it for you, look at those opportunities to volunteer. Get involved with organizations or groups or hobbies that you care about that allows you to meet people and have meaningful connections there.
Mm-hmm.
Be a good friend. A lot of data on how friendships increase the quality of our lives and how that enhances our just well-being at all.
Absolutely.
So moving from there, from the entry level or not having authority within an organization, mid-management, think about your epitaph. What is a life well lived? This is something each person has to decide, and it matters because it's going to be based on all those values and stuff you've built throughout your life. This will be your guiding light for how you interact within your organization, and it has that ripple effect that you talked about, Ben. If you raise your subordinates' job satisfaction, you could literally be saving their life, their marriage. It has a whole bunch of health benefits on the people around you. So even if you're with somebody that you even may have to let go for job performance-related issues, if you conduct yourself well, you can have a real positive impact on that person and how they get to move through life. So, Ben, senior levels of organization, C-suite, vice president, director, and above, what are some of the things they should be thinking about?
Sure. So I think it's some of the similar things, and I think a big theme there is, most of these people are a little bit further on in their careers, a little bit older perhaps, and I think at this point in your career, it's really about thinking about how are you building a positive legacy and thinking very deeply about and taking action on those types of ideas that come forth, right? And some of the things we've talked about here today. Right. The thing that I think is important to remember as you ascend the corporate ladder, as you get more senior in an organization, you already mentioned this, but as you get more senior, what you do has an ever-increasing ripple effect, right? You have more of an impact on people's lives, on their work. And if you're a senior executive, literally thousands of people could be suffering just because of your shenanigans.
Right.
And, that's something that should give you a little bit of pause if you're a senior executive in thinking about how you're making decisions and what those decisions and the outcomes of those choices are. I think sometimes it's very important if you're in a senior level, to get an outside perspective through a trusted confidant, a trusted advisor. This is something that we've done a lot with senior executives, just being that outside perspective to help calibrate what they're thinking about and how they're making decisions, because it can be very hard to see the forest when you're really in the thick of it, when you're in the trees, so to speak. And another thing that I think is really important for folks in their senior levels, and really all of us, to be thinking about the end, and not to be macabre, but I'm talking about death. I think it's important for us to think about the fact that, the mortality rate, as far as I know, is still 100%. Well, 100% mortality rate. Everybody will die at some point, right?
Absolutely. And I think the thing that I see a lot here is people just wind up at the end of their life. Yeah. It wasn't deliberate and perfect, or deliberate and purposeful every step of the way. So if you're an entrepreneur founder, you talk to them about what's your continuity plan. Like, none of them have like a succession plan, because it makes them challenge themselves to think about, well, what will this organization be like when I'm not around? Or if you're a C-suite person, you come in, they're not thinking, hey, this is a 5 or 7 year run. I mean, some people might, but the whole idea is like being intentional each step of the way helps you not be a victim of circumstance. So you eventually come out of your role, you hit retirement, and everything's empty for you. So I think you got a couple quotes from. Yeah.
So this is some stuff that comes from. I actually first came across these ideas from a TED Talk by a woman named Jane McGonigal, and we'll put a link up to that, where she's actually talking in this TED Talk about video games and the virtues of them, which is a little bit, she weaves in these ideas. But she was talking in that video about the 5 top regrets of the dying. And I did a little bit of digging, and this comes up from an Australian palliative care nurse. Her name was Bronnie Ware, and she spent a number of years caring for patients in the last 12 weeks of their lives. She found this so fascinating that she began to record kind of their dying epiphanies, and she put them on a blog, and then she actually wrote a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. Now, I have not read the book, but there's some good summaries out there, and we'll put a link up to the one that actually was posted in February of 2012 on the Guardian's website. And there's some really great things that I think we should all keep in mind when it comes to the top 5 regrets of the dying. So number 1, according to this nurse who had witnessed all these people going through the last few weeks of their lives, number 1 is, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. And this is quoting from her, from this article in The Guardian. This was the most common regret of all. When people realize that their life is almost over and look back clearly on it, it is easy to see how many dreams have gone unfulfilled. Most people had not honored even a half of their dreams and had to die knowing that it was due to choices they had made or not made. Health brings a freedom that very few realize until they no longer have it. So that's number 1. Wow.
And I think that speaks to the idea of like, nobody fantasizes like, hey, looking back on my life, I really want to reflect on being a jerk manager, or treating other people poorly. I mean, there may be something personal in somebody's life that might drive some of those like issues or behaviors, but I think you have to ask yourself, am I being the person that I want to be? So there's 2 things. One, don't take work super, super seriously. It is one aspect of who you are. Second, since we have to spend so much time on work, gosh, let's make the environment a place we would want to work, and a treatment of each other like we would want to be treated.
Absolutely. So that kind of brings us to number 2. And number 2 is, I wish I hadn't worked so hard. And and this, I'm quoting again, this came from every male patient
that I nursed. They missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship. Women also spoke of this regret, but as most were from an older generation, many of the female patients had not been breadwinners. All of the men I nursed deeply regretted spending so much of their lives on the treadmill of a work existence. So don't work as hard. And that's a tough thing when, everything that we talk about, for example, in a business school, we're talking about careers and working hard and everything. And I think it's important for us to realize that, hey, that's not all there is to life, right?
Right. And if you get, especially when you're coming out, I remember when I got out of grad school, I hopped on a project that had me flying out every Sunday night, Monday morning, back every Friday night, Saturday morning.
Yep.
And then, I was in the National Guard, still am, but, I had drill 1 weekend a month. So I was literally with my family 3 weekends a month, and maybe like 3 quarters. And you're like, yeah, I'm really paying those dues. I'm really working hard. But if you just hit that, grindstone so hard, you're actually going to short circuit the middle and end parts of your career, because you're not, getting boned up on those HR, technical things, those leadership models. You're not reading to expand your view of the world. So, you just become a super efficient tool or automaton, which will help you early. But when you're at those later issues, you have to face those philosophical dilemmas that we all face during our careers. You're actually not going to be as equipped as if you took some time out. Other people may be hitting the grind. They might pull ahead in the short term, but, taking a longer term approach and building your whole person's actually going to help you more.
Yeah, and I think part of it is just also being a little bit more patient with yourself with regard to your career progression, and realizing that, hey, I don't have to, be always, the first one to achieve this by this age or whatever. And I know that can be hard, especially when we're, comparing ourselves to each other, and it's very easy to do so. And, everybody's got their, as you mentioned, their curated social media, so it's very easy for us to look and compare, or at least compare ourselves with what people want to be sharing about themselves, right? Sometimes I wish that we just had a LinkedIn where we posted everything that we failed at and all the jobs we didn't get. Maybe I'll do that sometime. I think it'd be helpful. So number 3, I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. And I quote, "Many people suppress their feelings in order to keep peace with others. As a result, they settled for a mediocre existence and never became who they were truly capable of becoming. Many developed illnesses related to the bitterness and resentment they carried as a result." Wow. So I guess sometimes it's we have a tendency to sacrifice our own well-being in the name of getting along with others, or just having consensus with those around us.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of the differentiation data, which we didn't do it justice as far as how much we should cover, but being your own person is super important for your mental health and your just stability to run the marathon that is our working lives and how long we have to work.
Yeah. Absolutely. Number 4, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. And I quote, "Often they would not truly realize the full benefits of old friends until their dying weeks, and it was not always possible to track them down. Many had become so caught up in their own lives that they had let golden friendships slip by over the years. There were many deep regrets about not giving friendships the time and effort that they deserved. Everyone misses their friends when they are dying." Gosh, wow.
To bring up an old, I think it's still around, but there was a web model called classmates.com. And a lot of the data from that stuff speaks to this situation where people are, they let people come into their lives and go, and maybe they were close friends for a time and season. But when you get to that kind of end of life, now you want to reach out to everybody. I'll hear my parents say, "Oh yeah, so-and-so had a grandkid," or, they're super attached to all those things. But what I could never figure out is why let those relationships go fallow? Being in the military, you'll be put in assignment for somebody for a year, maybe 2 years, or, those kinds of situations. But we find this data that everybody in their latter years wants to go back and capture all those friends. Well, I mean, that's something I'm doing in my life personally. I am making a deliberate, conscious effort to keep up friendships. And for me, that often means I'm the one doing the calling and the emails and reaching out. But I'm confident that's going to pay a dividend for me, so I can live, I don't have to live with that regret of, hey, where are all my friends at? And also realizing that everybody's going through this point in life where they're super busy. They're having kids. They're launching their like a second career in their life or whatever it is. But that they're going to be appreciative too of keeping that contact.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I think I could take some lessons from you on all of that, because it was tough for me, because I went off to college and then went straight from there into active duty in the Navy and was, all over the country and the world and doing all that kind of stuff. And it made this gap in between some of my earlier friends and then some of my newer friends. And of course, I have some fantastic friends from all my military experiences, but I think that I haven't done that great of a job of keeping in touch with a lot of those folks. And I should do much more work, kind of in a deliberate fashion, like you were mentioning, to maintain all of that. Number 5, and this is again the top 5 regrets of the dying. Number 5, and the final one: I wish that I had let myself be happier. And I quote, "This is a surprisingly common one. Many did not realize until the end that happiness is a choice. They had stayed stuck in old patterns and habits. The so-called comfort of familiarity overflowed into their emotions, as well as their physical lives. Fear of change had them pretending to others and to themselves that they were content, when deep within they longed to laugh properly and have silliness in their life again."
I always think of this as like the corporate persona, how, especially if you're in the more formal company culture, everybody kind of puts on their suit of armor known as a suit. And, and they have this like executive presence posture. Yes. And sometimes I think just laughing and letting people realize there's human issues. A lot of people want to sterilize their presentation at work. And gosh, those cultures they're kind of a life suck, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I at least for me, I don't know, maybe there are some people who would really enjoy that. I haven't met any, but, I personally, love to laugh, and I think it's very important. And there's all kinds of data on how important it is for your health anyway, right? To laugh frequently. So, absolutely.
And I mean, it's the idea of bringing your whole self to work. Like if your spouse just passed away, are you going to be like, yay, let's do a trust fall during today's group meeting? Like, no, but there's also, I don't see a clear playbook or that kind of behavior modeled on how do you allow room for people's emotions and persons at work while still also getting stuff done.
Yeah, that's a tricky one because, on one hand, we certainly, find that it is important for people to be able to feel like they can bring their full selves to work, and that, your personal life, there is a bleed over into your professional life. And at the same time, there's, you don't want every manager to become or feel the need to become the therapist for all of their people. So I think it's a balance, and there's not an easy answer to that. I think it's a complex one. I think some of it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of developing those high quality relationships, so that you do have a sense for what's going on in the lives of the people that work around you. One thing I always tell my students is, don't assume that someone's performance issue at work is just due to them being lazy or just due to them, maybe not having the skills or something. You need to investigate that first, because they may have something going on that you don't know about. I'll say, what I always say is, look, like, you may really be upset with an employee, and you pull that employee into your office and you start berating them for their performance issues and saying how it's unacceptable. And then imagine that the employee turns to you and says, well, I got to tell you, my 6-year-old has leukemia.
Yeah. You are the worst person.
Right. So I think it's always important to develop those high quality relationships and to try to develop a good understanding of each other.
I mean, a key platform here is the idea that having a place of authentic connection is the way in which you're able to even really assess what's going on. Mm-hmm. So if you have a team of 10 and you don't allow in-group, out-group dynamics to develop, you have an authentic, real relationship, a real collaborative alliance with each one, you're going to be less likely to have a distorted view of who that person is and what's going on as far as at work and life. And then if you do have to have those discussions, it can come from a real place that values that person. So I think that's one theme that I think we've seen it in our podcast today, that hey, you can't fake this stuff. Real connections and real relationships really matter as far as making the best steps to be able to thrive in this kind of suboptimal corporate world.
Very well said.
Well, Ben, I think that's all the time we have for today. You want to take us on out?
Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.